A dark fluid dripped from the ceiling tile, landing with a dull splatter on the concrete below. The odor was immediate, pungent, organic, and sour. It had permeated the lower corridor of the Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Hospital for days, but no one had traced it to the overhead storage room until it began seeping into the hallway pharmacy. When maintenance staff removed the panel, the decomposed remains of a man tumbled partially through the opening, entangled in rotting insulation, smeared gauze, and hospital-issued fabric. The corpse belonged to Sandile Sibiya, a 53-year-old male admitted nearly 2 weeks earlier with a fractured femur. His injury was consistent with a high-impact fall, possibly from construction work, though records confirmed it was accidental and non-fatal. He had been scheduled for orthopedic transfer. That transfer never occurred. The presence of his body in a maintenance ceiling, inaccessible to patients and unrelated to any public passageway, immediately invalidated the hypothesis of a voluntary disappearance. From a forensic and tactical perspective, the ceiling space was neither reachable nor logical for someone with limited mobility. The femur, once fractured, would have rendered independent movement nearly impossible. This creates a clear behavioral contradiction. No rational scenario places a patient with compromised locomotion in an overhead duct without assistance or external manipulation. Early reports suggested Sandile was mentally unstable, a theory quietly circulated to explain erratic behavior or a supposed desire to flee. However, hospital records and witness statements contradicted this narrative. He had arrived lucid, cooperative, and compliant. The mental illness narrative, once formally corrected, reveals a more insidious behavioral pattern, a post-mortem attempt at character defamation, often used to preemptively justify institutional failure or conceal intent. The condition of the body, advanced decomposition, marked by accelerated tissue breakdown and the presence of biological runoff, suggests prolonged neglect. Temperature-controlled hospital environments typically slow decay. However, the insulation around the body, combined with poor air circulation in the duct, may have increased bacterial activity. No attempt at concealment beyond elevation was made, implying the body was moved in haste or under pressure. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, the individual responsible for moving the body likely possessed knowledge of the hospital's blind spots. Access to the storeroom ceiling required tools or keys not available to patients. Security logs showed no breach, suggesting internal familiarity. This points toward insider involvement, either direct or complicit. Motivations remain speculative, but can be grouped into two primary vectors. The first, administrative panic. If a medical error occurred, such as incorrect medication, delayed intervention, or physical trauma inflicted during treatment, a staff member may have attempted to remove the body to avoid investigation or litigation. The second, less probable but not dismissible, involves targeted violence or coercion, followed by concealment. There is no record of conflict or threats involving the victim, but in closed institutional environments, intra-facility abuse can go unreported or be deliberately overlooked. Psychological modeling of the offender, assuming individual action, suggests a risk-averse profile operating under acute stress. The act of hiding a body in a space above institutional view is not impulsive, it's logistical. It requires physical effort, planning, and, crucially, time without oversight. This indicates access during low-traffic hours, likely late-shift windows, and minimal monitoring of internal movement. The absence of any witness report suggests collusion or silent compliance among personnel. Institutionally, the failure to locate the body for 10 days demonstrates a breakdown in operational response. Patient transfer verification, bed counts, and basic follow-up protocols failed. The very presence of the smell for several days prior to discovery reflects both sensory desensitization among staff and organizational dysfunction. In forensic terms, the hospital itself became part of the concealment strategy, an unwitting accomplice structured by silence, routine, and procedural apathy. The body was eventually discovered not by an investigation but by decay. It was not a security audit, a staff inquiry, or even a family alert that triggered the alarm. It was the odor. That fact alone carries operational weight. When human life can disappear inside a system designed to preserve it, and no one notices until decomposition forces attention, it raises a fundamental question. Was this an isolated act of panic, or something more practiced, more embedded? That remains the most critical gap in the case: motive. Without a clear timeline of Sandile Sibiya's final movements, without camera footage or signed discharge records, there is no way to definitively identify who last had access to him. Yet, statistically, concealed bodies in institutional spaces rarely point to strangers. They point inward, toward familiarity, toward silence, toward calculated negligence or fear-driven erasure. Further examination must now turn to a different environment, one not defined by institutional failure, but by deliberate, organized manipulation. A case in which the victim did not vanish from public view overnight, but was gradually erased in plain sight. The entry point into the residence showed no signs of forced access. No shattered glass, no compromised lock, no visible disturbance to the frame or threshold. Yet, what occurred beyond that doorway reflected a complete erosion of personal boundaries, followed by a calculated transformation of the victim's identity and space. This was not a sudden act of violence, but an incremental occupation, a behavioral progression common among individuals operating under parasitic criminal intent. The victim, Brian Egg, had established a fixed daily rhythm. He engaged with his neighborhood, performed acts of community upkeep, and maintained regular contact with family. His disappearance, therefore, did not align with patterns of voluntary withdrawal. The transition from a known and connected presence to complete silence was abrupt and without preamble. This behavioral rupture, sudden, total, and without warning, typically signals external interference. Initial behavioral indicators within the residence, observed by neighbors, included unfamiliar individuals entering and exiting the premises at irregular intervals. These subjects made no attempt to blend into the neighborhood or align their conduct with the victim's known routines. Instead, they operated with a sense of entitlement, answering the door, responding to phone calls, and giving plausible but unverifiable explanations for Brian's absence. This suggests a form of territorial assumption, reinforced by rehearsed disinformation, aimed at extending control over the victim's environment for as long as possible. From a psychological standpoint, the individuals occupying the home displayed traits aligned with exploitative opportunism. Their actions were not erratic or impulsive. They were methodical. The decision to respond to a family phone call using the victim's number indicates a deliberate attempt to manipulate perception and delay scrutiny. This action extended the operational window during which the victim's absence could be disguised as benign. Subsequent observations, excessive use of cleaning agents, the appearance of industrial soap suds leaking beneath the door, and the presence of a strong chemical odor are consistent with staged post-crime sanitation. These are not signs of casual residence. They represent an effort to remove forensic evidence, especially biological fluids or trace DNA, following a violent event. The psychological profile of the perpetrators at this stage suggests an elevation in criminal awareness. They understood that decomposition and blood evidence could threaten their ability to continue exploiting the property. The introduction of an external third party, specifically a professional crime scene cleaning service, marks a transition point in the behavioral arc. Most amateur offenders avoid contact with formal businesses. Engaging such a service implies either extreme overconfidence or a false belief that financial transaction alone can suppress scrutiny. The presence of large sums of cash during this interaction reinforces the theory that the offenders had full access to the victim's financial assets, either through coercion prior to death or unauthorized use following it. Law enforcement's initial hesitation allowed these behaviors to escalate without immediate consequence. However, once physical entry was secured and forensic examination began, the concealment strategy collapsed. The storage space under the staircase was not structurally designed for habitation or storage. Its selection as a disposal site was driven by concealment value alone. Inside, a chemical-laced fish tank contained a single human torso, devoid of head and hands. This specific dismemberment pattern reflects a forensic awareness of identity prevention. Removal of biometric identifiers, in combination with chemical immersion, indicates that the offenders were aware of investigative procedures and attempted to disrupt them. The absence of defensive wounds or visible ligature suggests the victim may have been incapacitated prior to death. While toxicological data remains inconclusive, the behavioral context supports the theory of premeditated subdual, followed by murder and body processing. The time span between last known contact and discovery of remains aligns with a degradation timeline consistent with chemical exposure, which significantly alters decomposition rates and complicates cause-of-death analysis. Despite arrests and temporary detainment, both primary suspects were released. Procedurally, the case lacked direct linkage between the offenders and the exact moment or method of death. No confession, no eyewitness, and no surveillance footage closed the evidentiary gap. This strategic gap illustrates a recurring challenge in forensic homicide cases where offenders manipulate both the crime scene and the narrative timeline. What remains most significant is the psychological disassociation displayed by the suspects. No remorse, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, only financial usage and logistical management. This level of detachment, paired with high-functioning manipulation, is typical of individuals operating under Cluster B behavioral profiles, specifically antisocial or narcissistic traits, where the value of life is subjugated to personal utility. The disappearance of Brian Egg did not occur in an alley or a remote area. It unfolded in a neighborhood, inside a known residence, in proximity to multiple observers. That no one intervened until the body was unrecoverable in full reflects not only calculated behavior by the perpetrators, but also systemic hesitation in responding to subtle but persistent red flags. The question that follows is no longer how Brian died, but why those responsible were able to inhabit his identity, his space, and his absence for so long, without resistance. The next analysis will examine a different environment, one where disappearance was not hidden through lies, but normalized through indoctrination. The farmhouse was positioned more than 200 meters from the road, surrounded by trees and fenced off with no clear line of sight into its inner courtyard. The structure itself appeared aged but functional, with no external indicators of criminal activity. When officers first entered, what they encountered defied typical containment scenarios. A narrow stairwell led to a compact room, and inside were 6 individuals, pale, malnourished, silent. All claimed to be over 18, but none could produce documentation, and none were registered in national health or education databases. The initial behavioral assessment revealed clear signs of long-term isolation. The subjects exhibited delayed reaction times, minimal social responsiveness, and a uniform hesitancy to engage with external authority figures. These are indicators of entrenched psychological conditioning, consistent with group dependency models seen in cultic environments. The room they were found in contained improvised bedding, limited food supplies, and no visible means of external communication. Such an arrangement does not occur spontaneously. It requires planning, control, and reinforcement, both psychological and physical. The central controlling figure was identified as Gerrit Jan van D. a 7-year-old male with a history of ideological extremism. His operational method relied on restricting external input. No schooling, no medical contact, no media. By severing access to reality beyond the group, he was able to replace external truth with internal doctrine. This method is not unique. It mirrors the mechanisms of closed authoritarian systems, where reality is redefined to maintain power. The ideological framework, while not fully codified, exhibited doomsday characteristics, emphasis on purity, apocalyptic prophecy, and distrust of outside influence. This worldview justified seclusion and rationalized punishment. Disobedience or impurity, whether real or perceived, was reportedly met with extreme disciplinary actions. Prolonged fasting, exposure to cold, enforced silence. These methods are designed to create both dependency and fear, ensuring that even in the absence of physical barriers, psychological imprisonment remains intact. One subject, identified later as the oldest male, managed to exit the premises and approach a local establishment. His behavior, disoriented, withdrawn, and hypervigilant, aligned with post-escape trauma response. Only after multiple visits and under the influence of alcohol did he disclose the nature of his confinement. The delayed disclosure is a critical behavioral indicator. Victims of long-term psychological control often experience internal conflict when confronting outside systems. They may fear punishment, feel disloyal, or distrust external help, even when physically free. Further analysis revealed that not all victims were biological children. Some had unclear familial status, suggesting selective recruitment or extended manipulation. The secondary figure in control, identified as Joseph B., functioned as a facilitator. He managed logistics, secured property rentals, and maintained surface-level interactions with the community. His role was not ideological leadership, but operational shielding, buffering the central figure from scrutiny. This bifurcated structure, one ideological, one logistical, is a common model in high-control environments. It permits the maintenance of doctrine while ensuring the practical needs of the group are met. It also complicates accountability. While Gerrit Jan dictated internal rules, Joseph maintained external functionality. Both roles were essential to sustaining the system. Evidence recovered included handwritten journals, documenting schedules, punishments, and perceived transgressions. These writings lacked emotional nuance. Entries were procedural, rigid, and obsessive, traits often found in individuals with authoritarian or delusional ideation. There was no recognition of harm or empathy toward the confined individuals. Instead, the language was clinical, almost bureaucratic. Authorities confirmed that none of the children had been officially recorded at birth. This deliberate omission created a legal vacuum. Without records, they did not exist. No birth certificates, no school records, no health data. Such erasure serves two purposes. First, it prevents institutional detection. Second, it reinforces the captor's narrative that the outside world is either irrelevant or hostile. The long-term consequences of such isolation are severe. Subjects exhibit arrested development, impaired emotional regulation, and difficulty processing autonomy. Even when removed from confinement, rehabilitation requires years of structured support. Trust in external systems must be rebuilt from zero, often in the face of residual loyalty to the captor. While both primary suspects were arrested, legal resolution remains complex. The nature of psychological imprisonment is harder to prosecute than physical abuse. Victims may hesitate to testify. Memories may be fragmented. The line between coercion and perceived consent, especially after years of indoctrination, becomes blurred. Courts must navigate these layers carefully. The operational significance of this case lies not in the extremity of its methods, but in their success. For nearly a decade, a group of children was kept off-grid in Western Europe, without detection. The failure was not one of oversight, but of assumption, that such things could not happen in plain view. One unanswered question persists. If this level of control can be maintained in an open society, how many others, less extreme, less visible, might still remain undetected? Disappearance, when strategically executed, is not a passive condition, but an active process of erasure. Across case types, 3 dominant behavioral models emerge: concealment through force, concealment through manipulation, and concealment through systemic neglect. Each results in the removal of a subject from public visibility, but each is driven by distinct psychological motivations and operational choices. In force-based concealment, such as physical homicide followed by body disposal, the offender typically acts in response to immediate threat, exposure, confrontation, or loss of control. This model is reactionary. The psychological profile often includes impulsivity, fear of consequence, and a desire to restore dominance by eliminating the variable that introduced instability. Post-act behavior then shifts into logistical containment, involving spatial management and narrative substitution. Common signs include the use of chemical agents, sealed compartments, and access denial tactics. The offender may continue to exploit the victim's resources while maintaining a false front. This requires sustained cognitive dissonance and compartmentalization, suppressing empathy while enacting routine. In manipulation-based disappearance, the victim is not killed but psychologically displaced. The control is maintained through belief systems, isolation, and dependency loops. The offender does not erase the physical presence, but erodes the victim's access to autonomy and outside recognition. In these cases, disappearance becomes internal. Victims lose self-determination, are denied legal identity, and cease to function as independent entities. The offender's primary psychological drive is not to escape justice, but to construct an alternate ecosystem where power is absolute. This behavior is associated with delusional ideation, savior complexes, and rigid cognitive structures that reinterpret control as protection. Systemic, neglect-driven disappearance occurs when institutional inertia enables a person to vanish through a cascade of small oversights. A missing patient, unlogged transfer, or falsified chart can go unchallenged when protocols are treated as formalities. In these contexts, disappearance is not always the result of malice. It can emerge from sustained indifference, bureaucratic fragmentation, or fear of liability. Yet the psychological impact mirrors intentional acts because the effect is the same. The subject ceases to exist in records, in care systems, and ultimately in life. Here, the offender may not be a singular actor, but a structure of silent compliance. Common across all models is the calculated manipulation of perception. Offenders rely not just on physical separation, but on delaying or distorting recognition, answering phones in the victim's voice, fabricating movements, or altering documentation are all expressions of cognitive control. These behaviors indicate high-functioning deceit, often without external remorse. The psychological architecture behind such acts reflects antisocial traits, lack of empathy, exploitative reasoning, and absence of guilt. When paired with intelligence and planning ability, these traits create offenders who are not reactive, but strategic. Victim selection is rarely random. Targets are often socially isolated, physically limited, or perceived as unguarded. This increases the success rate of disappearance while lowering the perceived risk of detection. The offender calculates not just how to remove a body, but how long until someone notices, and whether anyone will challenge the explanation when they do. This operational calculus is central to understanding the psychology of disappearance. It is not about the event itself, but about managing aftermath. The final behavioral consideration involves post-disappearance conduct. Offenders who remain at the scene, engage with authorities, or continue using victim resources are not merely reckless. They often believe the disappearance was successful enough to create a new baseline reality. This overconfidence can lead to behavioral leaks, cleaning in daylight, repainting, or openly using financial accounts. These actions reflect a belief that the narrative has been controlled, and any remaining uncertainty will dissolve over time. When these patterns appear, they mark a transition from concealment to possession, a psychological shift where the offender now treats the victim's space, assets, and history as their own. What remains unresolved in many of these cases is not the method of disappearance, but the silence that followed. Silence from institutions. Silence from bystanders. Silence from systems designed to protect visibility. The absence of resistance is often the final variable that makes disappearance sustainable. The next and final phase of this analysis will assess how these models of disappearance, whether born from violence, control, or collapse, reveal broader patterns in the human willingness to look away. The capacity for disappearance within controlled environments, whether institutional, domestic, or ideological, relies not only on the actions of perpetrators, but on the absence of resistance from the surrounding structure. Each of the examined cases reflects a form of psychological warfare waged in silence, where visibility becomes a liability and isolation is reinforced through repetition, compliance, or fear. These were not public crimes, nor were they impulsive. They were concealed behind routines, within trusted spaces, and under the assumption that nothing dangerous could happen in familiar places. The psychological mechanisms enabling such concealment are grounded in exploitation. Offenders assess vulnerability not only in the physical condition of the victim, but in the environment's capacity to respond. A hospital with procedural blind spots, a neighborhood with low intervention thresholds, a rural compound beyond regulatory reach. These conditions do not cause disappearance, but they permit it. They shape how the act is executed, how long it remains hidden, and how it is rationalized once uncovered. In terms of behavioral architecture, the offenders in each case demonstrated varying levels of premeditation. Some operated on situational opportunity, escalating once they recognized the absence of challenge. Others maintained control through long-term planning, gradually eroding the victim's autonomy and external identity until no intervention seemed possible or necessary. Across both models, the goal was not simply to remove a person, but to suppress the consequences of their absence. This suppression requires a calculated manipulation of narrative. Perpetrators create explanations that delay inquiry, shift attention, or neutralize suspicion. They rely on others to accept inconsistencies, overlook anomalies, and defer action. Silence in this context is not merely inaction, it becomes a shield, one built from institutional rigidity, social disengagement, or cognitive fatigue. Over time, the absence of challenge reinforces the offender's belief that the victim no longer occupies a space worth defending. The psychological impact on victims is equally significant. In cases of physical disappearance, the violence is immediate. But in cases of psychological disappearance, such as prolonged containment or identity erasure, the damage accumulates. Victims lose the frameworks that define reality: time, self-determination, external feedback. Re-entry into public life, if it occurs, is often marked by confusion, distrust, and delayed trauma processing. These effects persist long after legal resolution, making rehabilitation a sustained multidimensional challenge. From a criminological standpoint, these cases reinforce the principle that disappearance is not defined solely by physical absence. It includes the collapse of recognition, voice, and protection. A person can be surrounded by others and still be invisible if their distress is not acknowledged or acted upon. This dynamic reframes the role of bystanders, not as passive observers, but as critical points of intervention whose presence or absence can shape outcomes. Each of the environments examined, medical, domestic, ideological, functioned as enclosures, not through physical barriers, but through layered systems of control, neglect, or distortion. These systems often presented themselves as protective, orderly, or spiritual. Yet, within their boundaries, harm was allowed to flourish. In this context, disappearance is not an anomaly. It is the logical conclusion of unchecked control operating in silence. The responsibility, therefore, does not rest solely on individual offenders, but on the larger frameworks that failed to detect, question, or interrupt the pattern. Legal systems, care institutions, and communities must recognize that harm does not always declare itself loudly. It often enters quietly, through familiar doors, speaking familiar language, wearing the face of trust. The study of these cases highlights the need for structural attentiveness, not only to obvious threats, but to the subtle indicators of isolation, narrative control, and behavioral inconsistency. Prevention requires more than vigilance. It requires systems that are willing to challenge comfort, to intervene early, and to treat visibility as a safeguard, not a privilege. The war inside walls is not fought with force. It is fought with silence, avoidance, and the slow removal of identity. To detect it, one must understand not only what has been done, but what has been allowed.